Good morning, everybody. All right. Good morning, online folks. So the day has finally arrived for the birth of Isaac. We have been waiting for this since chapter 12. So a couple months of being in Genesis, talking about the promise that doesn't come for over 13 years. We're told Abraham's 86, 87 at one point, and then he's turning 100, and it still hasn't happened. And so here we are at the birth of Isaac. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Abraham's had quite a journey over these chapters. He has been told to leave everything he knows, his family's land, to go to a foreign place, being told that not only will we have descendants that number the stars, but that all of the land that he sees will eventually be his. And yet so much has happened to make him disbelieve the promise. We had this moment in chapter 15 where there was that really powerful line that finally something clicked for Moses, and that belief was credited to him as righteousness, that his righteousness came through faith. He's had moments of dipping down and not believing the promise, but here it comes to pass. What an interesting line from Sarah. Who would have ever said that this would happen? Well, God, multiple times, has said that it would happen, and here it comes to take place. We're going to get into a more complicated story with Hagar and Ishmael, but any questions or comments now that we have finally arrived at this moment? Yeah, Diane?
It just struck me as I was reading this that it seems interesting that they were so worried about what would happen when they went, with Abimelech and things like that, with other women in Egypt, where Sarah was said to be Abraham's sister and not his wife. And I thought, well, they portrayed her as being pretty old. Was that really a big deal? I mean, don't think that she would have drawn the attention of a king or they were.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
It just is the strangeness of the ages and timing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Diane makes a very interesting observation that we have two stories of Abraham being really worried that someone's going to kill him in order to take his wife. And so they pass her off as his sister. And we're also told that she's of an old age, past childbearing years. And so very interesting that she would have been so coveted. And yet the text makes a point to say that she was alluring to these folks. Yeah. Don't know what to do with that, but interesting. Anything else?
Are you recording?
I believe I am. Yeah. Believe I am. Yes. All right. Now I'm going to be very curious just to get your perspective on this as we read through Hagar and Ishmael. What's going to be very clear in this next section is this is a story about the covenant family. That the text makes it very clear that Abraham and Isaac are the ones that God has chosen, that the ones whom God is going to create this great nation. And yet there's this very powerful moment in the way that God interacts with Hagar and Ishmael, and the fact that their text is put into the Bible at all. It could have been a story only about Isaac, and the compilers of Genesis intentionally chose to talk about Ishmael in a way that lifts Ishmael up as another great nation. So let's talk about that after we read. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. All right. So it's interesting to have this dialogue from God, an intervention from God, where God endorses the behavior of Sarah, allows Abraham to do whatever she says. Not necessarily that what she says is going to be just, but that God has other plans for this boy. And so Sarah casting him from this covenant family will not be the end of his story. And so Abraham gives them bread and water and sends them off into the wilderness. That's a clue for us that this is not quite the preparation that they should have. The wilderness of Beersheba, we're talking about desert. I don't know what you envision when you hear the word wilderness in your own minds. Maybe it's forest land, but the wilderness of the ancient Near East is desert land, hills, sand dunes, no water. And so what comes to pass is something that should have been predicted, that they run out of water, and Hagar doesn't want to watch her child die, and so she puts him under a bush. And just as we will see in so many other passages, God hears the cry of the distressed. And so God responds. And the response from God is the response we hear often through Scripture: do not be afraid. We hear that so often. We hear that in the nativity story. Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy and will provide. All right, reactions, comments. Why do you think this is in the story?
This is either really obvious or completely off base, but I wonder if the commentators link this story to Abraham sacrificing Isaac. I mean, there seem like a lot of parallels, but
Yeah.
parent to a child sent off into the wilderness.
Yeah. So Kevin's question is, I wonder if commentators link this to the story of Isaac. And I think we're going to have time to get to that story today, the binding of Isaac. Absolutely. And as we've mentioned before, the Quran is even going to put Ishmael into the role of Isaac. And so Isaac will be part of that binding story. But this does have a lot of parallels where God's promising to make this child a great nation, sending this couple off into the wilderness is a death sentence. It seems as if Abraham's sacrificing these two people. Is there a bit of faith here? And we'll talk about that in the next story of trusting in the promise again. They're going to be okay. If I send them off, God has told me that everything will be well with them. Yeah, a lot of parallels.
Do Hagar and Ishmael appear again?
Do Hagar and Ishmael appear again? No.
So Koran is where they're.
We're going to have theological references to them, but I'm trying to think. Can't think of anything. Yeah.
So we're just what?
Yeah. Ben?
This thing about him being so skilled with the bow reminds me of like the Romans allowing Josephus to write about how great the Jews were in the Levant, or even like how Caesar writes about the Gauls. Like these are not just the people that you can. It's actually they're a formidable opponent. They're people that it's not just easy to come and have a war and win against. It's the fact that you can take them on and win is significant.
Yeah.
It's kind of a way of building them up a little bit.
Yeah. By attributing great strength or prowess to your enemy is a way to say this isn't an easy victory. Makes your own victory seem all the more magnificent because you were able to conquer these people skilled with the bow. Yeah. How are we feeling about this behavior? Why do you think this makes it into the biblical text? Yeah, Robin?
Well, it's almost like a writer type who says.
A writer tying up loose ends. We have this major character. What happens? Yeah, Robin?
There's when there's persecution in the early Christian church and early Christians spread people from Rome to get away from central areas where they're more persecuted. I wondered, and there's not clear evidence, but whether sending Hagar away, it's like, okay, you're going to have a separate land, a separate place, and if they had stayed together, just like Lot and Abraham, together, there's a limit to how much you can grow.
Yeah.
There's sort of more potential.
Yeah.
Anybody would really say that or think that.
No, I think that is a great observation, kind of drawing a parallel to the story of Abraham and Lot, where they come to this conclusion that their livestock can't graze the same grounds, and so they split up in order for this growth. And in this moment that Hagar and Ishmael, Sarah and Isaac, there's just not enough room for both of these potentially great nations to thrive, and so there has to be this moment of separation. Yeah, Barbara?
Although we see that Ishmael has a substantial legacy, he does not inherit the covenant with God.
Even though Ishmael is going to have this legacy, he does not inherit the covenant with God. Yeah, to be God's chosen people, there's no promise, there's no birthright, there's no blessing, there's no covenant. Yeah. Melissa? What'd you say?
He's the son of a slave.
Son of a slave. Yeah. Melissa?
Just kind of curious that Abraham's faith is continuously being tested by huge acts, not just like, seems over and over and over again.
Abraham's faith continually being tested. It's not just one, I want to make sure you're with me, but this test again and again and again. Yeah. And we'll talk more about that. Lisa?
But it's interesting, in 18 it says, come lift up the boy and hold it fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of that hand. So I don't know if that's not necessarily covenant, but still, that's a promise. Exactly, I mean, it's like, yeah.
It's a promise, yeah. Even though it might not be this language of chosen, this is a promise. It is this unilateral covenant. There's no expectations being made of Ishmael, but God is promising this great nation. Yeah. And Shirley, I liked your comment too. Hagar's crying out, but God's also able to hear the cry of this boy that's not in the text, and yet God is still able to hear it from something vulnerable.
You know how old Ishmael was at this point?
Yeah, I'm thinking that Ishmael's around like 13 at this point, just trying to remember the timeline, but yeah.
As you put him under
That doesn't track, right? No, he's not he's not an infant. I think he's gonna get up and walk around and yeah,
13 when Isaac is conceived, so.
yeah. I just marvel at how often Scripture does kind of lay bare the sins of its own people, and is willing to put in the text these vulnerabilities, these mistakes, is willing to put in here that this God we worship, this God that we call our God, this God that we believe has chosen us, this God is also in relationship with the other nations and is looking after the other nations and is raising up the other nations, is making them into great nations. That these little peeks into their coming to realize the expansiveness of God that is beyond their own vision, that is beyond their own ideas of what God is up to in the world. And to put it here, Sarah and Abraham are being rude, they cast him out, but God takes care of this child. Any other comments or thoughts? Yeah, Donna?
I'd love to see the map where everything was, because they talk about, she went into Egypt because she was Egyptian, Hagar did, so she could get an Egyptian wife for him. I think, was that like 20 miles that way, or how far away were all these things?
Well, yeah, to get into Egypt, you're crossing the Sinai, getting into the Sinai Peninsula. That's a trek.
I can't even imagine how much land they occupied.
Yeah. And again, this is all foreign land for Abraham. This is not his home. This is Philistine land. This is Canaanite land. This is Egyptian land. So none of this is Israel yet. And so all of this is foreign territory. Yeah, but Egyptians could have been in that area, but to get to Egypt would have been a journey.
But were they actually in what was Hagar's territory at the time, since she was Egyptian? Or did that not matter with geography?
They weren't, no.
Just people wandering separately from each other?
Yeah, potentially caravans. Yeah. Ben?
Maybe there's any scholars of Islam or Quranic scholars, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the Quran specifically states that it was Ishmael taken up on the mountain, but it's just more part of tradition, and it's just understood to be it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Thanks, Ben. Saying that it's just part of the tradition more so than part of the Quranic text to have Ishmael on the mountain. All right, so Abimelech is the commander who we saw in the story from last week that was tricked into believing that Sarah was Abraham's sister. So he's going to circle back to the story. At that time, Abimelech with Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity. But as I have dealt loyally with you, you will deal with me and with the land where you have resided as an alien. And Abraham said, I swear it. When Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs of the flock, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs you shall accept from my hand in order that you may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. When they had made a covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech with Phicol, the commander of his army, left and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham resided as an alien many days in the land of the Philistines. This story is one of our etiologies or origin stories, how something got its name, how something came to be. And so there would have been this well that the Israelites owned in the middle of Philistine land in Beersheba. And so people would have wondered, how in the world did we get this well? How do we own this? And so there's this story of Abraham asking digging a well of his own, getting it taken from him, and then creating this covenant with Abimelech saying, here, take these ewes, our little Israelite ewes, and in the future, when someone tries to take this well, I'll remind you by saying, look at that part of your flock, that's from us. That should remind you that this well belongs to us. And so just kind of some ancient treaty making, ancient bartering and deal making. Not a lot of theological content here, but any comments or thoughts? Yeah, Ben?
The chronology is all messed up here, because it's already Beersheba in verse 14.
Yep.
And he was
Yep,
already
yep.
Beersheba, I think, previously. And there's a well there that had already existed by the time, they're making this covenant down in 22 and on. And Hagar goes there with just a skin of water, and she runs out and there's no water, but there's already a well there. So it's just like very, unless it was a way to like talk about, maybe he sent them there because there was a well there that was already claimed and owned, or Providence or something like that. But the chronology is messed up.
So we're gonna have to have a word with the editors. They didn't keep their timeline consistent.
Maybe wells aren't active wells like the Lacey's you think of. Maybe they're wells you have to redig each time that you're coming through, because if you describe it as a desert, so we don't really know if that's amenable to life. It seems to be if you could raise sheep and other animals there.
Yeah, so some of them would have been permanent. And so what would happen in the desert for these caravans is you would not have a drawn map of where the wells were. Instead, it would be knowledge that you would carry with you. It was top secret, highly confidential information, and different people groups would intentionally cover up wells, hide the wells. They didn't want other people coming and taking their water source where they knew where it was. And so there's this just sort of mental network of where the water sources were. They would be permanent and accessible, but not necessarily very evident. So yeah, what's going on here is no consistent timeline. We've got these bits and pieces, oral material, written material that are just being, go ahead, Melissa.
No, just like,
Just trying to track
yeah.
that little. We have little snippets that are being inserted into the text. And so they're not necessarily inserting the snippets at the exact right place. Does it make more sense for this little snippet to come before the story of Hagar and Ishmael? Definitely. So it's already called Beersheba by this point. We're already told that she sees this well water. But now we're trying to give a little backstory. Any other comments or thoughts? All right. We have time. Okay. We've talked before about how it's really powerful that in Jewish tradition, there is not the same emphasis we have within Christian biblical interpretation, that there is a single way to understand or interpret a text, and we're trying to get to the right interpretation, that within Jewish sacred texts, the dialogue is all about multiple interpretations. How do we understand this? What can we draw from it? What can we dialogue about it? 2 rabbis, 3 opinions about the text is the saying. And so the story of the binding of Isaac, or if anyone's heard the phrase, the Akedah, the Hebrew phrase, that's the binding of Isaac, is one of the most debated and discussed texts within Hebrew tradition. And so you can read so many different interpretations about what's going on. And we'll try to come to our own conclusions as well. After these things, God tested Abraham. We're going to get this dichotomy between testing and promising. Why would God test someone? Is God testing someone? Well, we're told very clearly in the text, God tests Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, There's a really funny rabbinical tradition about this verse. I'm imagining what Abraham is saying that's not present in the biblical text. Take your son. Well, which son, God? Your only son. I have two, God. Isaac, whom you love. And go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had showed him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them walked on together. I'm going to pause there for just a moment and point something out. We're going to get another dialogue between God and Abraham that's going to have parallels to these other 2 moments of dialogue that you probably noticed were very similar to each other, to where we have the cry out. God says, Abraham. Isaac says, Father. Abraham responds, "Here I am." God gives instructions. Isaac asks a question. In the 3rd dialogue, we're going to have 3 parts, just like the first one. But in this middle dialogue, we have a 4th response that kind of serves as the fulcrum of the entire story. That's this: God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So what does Abraham believe or think in this moment? Does Abraham think that it could potentially be Isaac who's the lamb? Poor Isaac in this symbological moment has to carry the wood on his back as if he's already being offered up on the altar for the burnt offering. Or does Abraham believe that if God has promised to make a great nation, that Abraham can follow God's instruction and God will intervene, that even if Abraham sacrifices Isaac truly, that God will somehow bring Isaac back from the dead? There's certainly a question of resurrection here. When they had came to the place that God had showed him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Abraham's about to follow through with it. How much does he trust this promise? He's about to bring the knife down. The angel of the Lord cries out, has to say it 2 times, "Abraham, Abraham." It's a dire moment. Abraham responds in the same way, "Here I am." "Do not lay your hand on the boy, for now I know that you fear God." This seems like a wild test of faith. Melissa pointed out, we've had so many other tests of faith. Why this one? But if Abraham really did have this deep, intense faith that God would provide the lamb, or would provide the nation that was promised, or would provide through his son Isaac, well, God does follow up with a promise and provides a burnt offering instead of Isaac. If anyone wants to get really deep into this text, you can read some Kierkegaard. You can read the book Fear and Trembling, which deals with this story and uses a phrase that we use today. Maybe we could translate it, the phrase, the way we say it is kind of a leap of faith, or a leap into the absurdity, that sometimes faith requires us, like Abraham, to just jump into the unknown, trusting that somehow there's something there to catch us or something there to provide the burnt offering, but without having evidence of the promise. Toby's disturbed. You want to say anything?
This seems to me to totally contradict any thought of free will on the part of men. And it returns me to Emma Black, or whatever his name is. I was really bothered by last week, the story, because Abimelech seems to me totally blameless, but he acts out of fear. And God is very coercive towards it. And here, Abraham Abraham has no choice. I'm a baby boomer, my counterculture, all I can think of is Dylan. God said to Abraham, kill me a son, and Abe said, man, you must be putting me on. And, it just, Abraham isn't exercising any free will.
Yeah. Toby says there seems to be a complete lack of free will here. It's coercion, it's manipulation. There may be an element of free will here in that Abraham has the right to say no, or this is absurd, or I'm not going to do it.
God.
And so
You
you're
fear me. You
fear.
you
Yeah.
have a fear of God. You're a good man.
Yeah. And the history, what was that?
So if you go back to the original word here.
So the question is, the original word fear is a respect. Yeah. So there's a long theological history of understanding this concept of fear. Is it to be afraid of? Is it to respect? There's a lot more nuance in that term fear, certainly within the Hebrew, and within the Hebrew and the Christian traditions of a respect. That's why it's called fear and trembling, to where you know that the power is so much greater than what you could ever imagine. And so you are just kind of lost in the power of it all. Awestruck, the awesomeness of it is kind of the root of the fear. Yeah, Robin?
When I first became a mother and we read this, I've read it many times, I heard the story growing up, but it just really struck me that Isaac must have been kind of messed up for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And Kevin said to me, a God who can raise people from the dead could heal Isaac from this trauma. But looking at it now, if it's true that Genesis was written during the exile, that this was written by, even an oral story, then the story almost certainly came through Isaac. Like that he must have passed it on to his children. And it was passed down. And that changes it slightly for me. Think of it that way.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot there. Robin said, hearing the story as a child, reading it all her life, then reading it after having a child, the lens on that continually shifts. And just thinking, what did you say that made everyone laugh? It made me laugh too. Oh, I messed them up. Yeah. And so the idea that Isaac would have been scarred by this, completely messed up, Robin says, yeah, absolutely. A lot of needed therapy. Your father put you on wood and is raising a knife and is about to bring it down, and only an angel of the Lord stopping. And you've seen the paintings of this scene of the angel holding Abraham's hand from coming down, would be really traumatic. And then the point was made that if this is an oral story being passed down, written down in the exile, then it most certainly was Isaac and his family that passed the story down. And yeah, you can imagine Isaac telling his kids, like, my father did this. And we very importantly to what you're saying is we're told everyone who was with them was told to stay back. These are the only two who know what went down on the mountain. And I like what you said about the exile, because we can also read this story through the lens of the exile, to where, okay, we're in a situation again where the promise of God looks bleak. We're in a foreign land. Our temple has been destroyed. Our religion is at threat of being completely eliminated. Remember the story of Abraham and Isaac, where in this great moment of testing of their faith, Abraham was willing to potentially sacrifice his son, knowing that God would provide. And so as they write that down in the exile, they're thinking about that. Do we trust that God's going to provide for us in this moment right now? Barbara?
I guess a great story is going to last forever with interpretations. I know one Jewish thought about the story is that Abraham, left without telling Sarah where he was going. And one thought of that is that she died of a shocked and broken heart. Coming back and learning of actually what happened.
Yeah.
And another Christian interpretation is a foreshadowing of the passion, because Isaac is carrying the wood just as Jesus carried the cross and for an only son and all that. So, I mean, we never stop interpreting this story.
Yeah. Barbara just saying, thinking of two interpretations she's heard of, that a great story lends itself to a lifetime, generations, millennia of interpretation. And one Jewish tradition saying that Abraham leaves without telling Sarah. And so Sarah has no idea what's going on, and she is going to die soon in the text, and that she died of a broken heart in this moment. And then another Christian interpretation that this is a foreshadowing of the passion, that Isaac carrying the wood on his back is Christ carrying the cross on his back. And again, in that passion story, to think of Christ asking, let this cup pass from me, and yet continuing to face the suffering ahead of him, trusting that God would provide, that the death on the cross was not the end of the story either.
Yeah, just, Isaac, again, I'm not tracking the chronology very well, but we know that Abraham was hungry. Isaac was bound. Isaac allowed himself to be bound. There's no way that I will find what 13, 15-year-old.
But there's probably no way a 100-year-old father engenders a son either.
Yeah.
Or the woman is attractive, etc.
Yeah.
This all seems very Freudian.
All very Freudian.
Genesis so far has struck me as being about bad dads. Starting with the Almighty dad.
Oh.
The story so clearly focuses on Abraham, but Isaac, what's Isaac's posture during this? His mindset, he's scared.
Yeah.
What was the test of his faith as well?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's Isaac of an age of reason where he can have his faith tested.
Yeah.
Does he actually?
Oh gosh. Yeah, so it doesn't say, but the tradition is probably that kind of bar mitzvah age of 13. Same age that Ishmael was miscast. That's probably why it's part of the tradition of dating them. Okay, there was like 15 great comments there to unpack. So Kevin's saying, what's the posture of Isaac because of Abraham's age? It's going to be hard for him to bind a 13-year-old who, when we think of the silliness of Ishmael being left under the bush, the silliness of Isaac just willingly being bound up, he's going to have some questions about what's going on. Like, we've never done this before, Dad. Like, what where's that burnt offering that you told us we're going to go offer? So to think about Isaac's posture here, Melissa, you just said perhaps this is a test of Isaac's faith as well. Yeah, I think part of the Jewish interpretive tradition is to ask questions of the gaps. And this is getting my mind running because our next sermon series is going to be called Mind the Gap, and looking at stories where there's like major gaps in the story, and how do we fill those in? And that is part of the interpretive tradition in both Jewish thought and then later Christian thought. A lot of the sacred texts that don't make it into scripture that are considered apocryphal are texts that try to fill in the gaps. Stories about Jesus's childhood, for example. So what is Isaac feeling? What is his posture? Has he been told about the promise? Has Abraham sat him down and said, hey, Isaac, God has promised you're going to be the father of a great nation, and that through you, we're going to have land as far as the eyes can see, and your descendants will look like the stars. And so is this a test of Isaac's faith as well? Another one of Kierkegaard's faith phrases is a suspension of disbelief. Now, we can't take that leap until we suspend our disbelief. So there's a lot of disbelief, right, Toby? Yeah. And I like what you're saying, the bad dad. We did a sermon series called Bad Dads of the Bible. And God was on the chopping block for sacrificing Christ. My God, why have you forsaken me? So, okay, I think we need to linger here some more next week. We're not done with this story, but our time has run out. Before we pause on the binding of Isaac, any last things that you want to say or questions you want to make sure we tackle next week? Yeah, Lisa?
The humorous one, we're talking about Isaac, the oral tradition, all I could think of is like, when his kids are complaining, he's saying as a dad, like, you don't know what I went through.
Yeah.
Playing children.
Definitely. When Isaac is dealing with his kids, you don't know what I went through. You think you have a bad dad? Let me tell you. Oh, wow. Yeah, I think it's a powerful image for Isaac and Abraham to walk up that mountain and leave the servants. And then to think from their point of view, okay, there's two people coming back.
And also the wood, it was interesting, the wood on his back, that was so metaphorical.
Oh my gosh.
And never, when
definitely.
he said he carried the wood, I'm like, oh, that's such a foreshadowing.
Absolutely. And it wasn't two people coming. I mean, we have they're up there. Is there a third person up there? Is that what you mean?
No,
Angel
I'm talking about the theory maybe we talked about next week about people actually follow through with it, and there's some texture of it.
Yeah. So let me show you what that is. There we go. So Abraham returned to his young men. It doesn't say anything about Isaac, so we can talk about that next week. All right, let me close this with a word of prayer. God, as we come before you and this text that has troubled the souls of many, of all who seek to follow you, we wonder what it means to have faith in your promises, but also to have these moments where it seems as if our faith is tested, where it seems as if our faith is shaken to its core. And so we pray that despite the challenges and hardships we face in this world, that we can continue to have faith in what it is that you're doing and what it is that you have called for us to do as well, to be able to leap into this great unknown as a community of faith. In Christ's name, amen. All right, thanks everyone.